What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
The situation today is far more dangerous than during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and far more dangerous than during the intermediate-range missile crisis in the beginning of the 1980s. But the public awareness has been squashed by a relentless war propaganda which has demonized Russia and increasingly China, eradicated any historic memory in parts of the population, and leaves others with a feeling of despair about what to do. Indeed, what is to be done in this amazingly dangerous moment of history? The Schiller Institute is circulating internationally an appeal to the President of the United States, that is President Biden, to urgently return to the policies of John F. Kennedy, as it is expressed in his peace speech given today 60 years ago.
This conference today is very important. It has brought us together from varied countries and backgrounds with varied opinions. What we have in common is the need for peace and disarmament in our world. This is therefore a meeting of hope. I believe that we have got to see the difficulties we have and to work to try to correct them. One of our first duties is to try to break the masses out of the mental imprisonment which the mainstream media has placed on them in most of our societies.
I was struck listening to President Kennedy's appreciation of the values and of the achievements of the enemies of that time. I don't see in this kind of Russophobia any kind of position like this, and this is extremely dangerous. So, public opinion in Europe is completely irrational. They don't understand that the perception of the Russian is that this war is an existential threat for them. It's in some way much worse than the Cold War. This is the reason why in their doctrine there is the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons.
The Mozart Requiem, Confutatis maledictis. Well, yeah, let the evildoers be confused and dissipated. I prefer to focus on voca me, voca nos, cum benedictis. Call us together with those who are blessed. Blessed are the peacemakers. And this is about peacemaking, this conference today. And I just want to start by applauding you all for organizing this, for facing up to the momentous situation today, and taking into account this key speech, which shows us so much about what the path ahead could be.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal.
Welcome to today's town meeting, Manhattan town meeting of the LaRouche organization. We are today going to be devoting our discussion to a kind of after discussion of last week's Schiller Institute's special symposium, The World Needs JFK's Vision of Peace. Now, there are many matters we're going to take up today, and in the course of them, you'll see how urgent it has become that people in the United States in particular, but throughout the transatlantic sector, get a sense of why the call made by Helga Zepp LaRouche and for an international peace coalition, which would involve many different organizations, setting aside secondary differences among them for the purpose of moving to as rapidly as possible end the danger of thermonuclear war, which is far more real than any other danger that people think they face. We had the conference last week, and what will be happening in the course of the next week is in various venues and in various ways, this American University speech made 60 years ago by John F. Kennedy will be being echoed and discussed. To begin today's proceedings, we're going to have Harley Schlanger, spokesman for the LaRouche organization. He also participated last week in a discussion at that conference. So Harley, good to see you, and the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Dennis, and good to see you. Well, I'm going to talk about the question of the fight against colonialism, as this was brought up at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in the speech delivered by President Putin of Russia. For those who don't know about this, and if you live in the West, you probably don't know about it, 100 nations attended this conference. There were many businessmen, people involved in finance, economics, and it was a proof that Antony Blinken has no clue of what's going on in the world, as he continues to run around talking about how isolated Russia is. In contrast, listen to the words of Putin there. he said that what we're doing is consolidating something new. He said the ugly international system, which was neocolonial in nature, has ceased to exist. Meanwhile, he continued, the multipolar world order is being reinforced, and this process is inevitable. Those are the words of Vladimir Putin to the attendees of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Now, he's not just speaking out of thin air. There was, right at the same time, the president of Algeria was in Moscow talking about joining the BRICS. The Egyptians have applied and supposedly will be accepted as members of the BRICS. The leader of the BRICS Development Bank, Dilma Rousseff, has been virtually everywhere talking about extending the credit system that will break the power, the blackmail power of the old credit system of the International Monetary Fund and the central banks. So what we're seeing is something that's becoming an unstoppable force, as Putin said. And what's holding it back is the fact that the West, and by the West I mean in particular the United States, the United Kingdom, and the NATO countries, and you can throw in the Five Eyes countries as well, Australia certainly part of this, are opposed to it because they prefer the present neo-colonial system. And they're fighting to protect that by moving against Russia and Ukraine. That is, the Ukraine war has nothing to do with freedom and democracy in Ukraine and everything to do with what Secretary Austin said at the first Ramstein meeting of weakening Russia. And why do they want to weaken Russia? Because as the dollar system is no longer bearable for nations of the global south, the former colonial nations, the potential of this new system of trade and settlements and trade in regional and national currencies as opposed to dollars is moving into a new phase. The president of Kenya, Ruto, asked the relevant question. Why should Kenya, when it's doing business with Djibouti, have to pay in dollars? Why can't we use national currencies? So we're seeing this shift underway, and I want to give some background to this, first by just emphasizing why this is an imperial system that's collapsing, and then a couple of insights from past presidents, including John Kennedy, against the idea of colonialism. Now, the idea that this is an imperial system, all you have to do is look over the last period from 1991, from the fall of the Soviet Union, to the emergence of what has been called the sole superpower, the unipolar order, the U.S. hegemon, what Blinken calls the rules-based order. This is a form of colonialism. You have to join the club if you want to be allowed to trade, if you want to have credit. If you're not part of the club, like Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or many, many others, you're subject to regime change, color revolutions, assassinations, and warfare. Now, the idea that has been there for many years goes back to the non-aligned movement from the 1950s, that there doesn't have to be a division into two blocks, but the idea of two blocks of nations, the East and the West or the North and the South, is convenient for maintaining power. This goes back to British geopolitics and the division and the use of divisions, whether they're tribal, ethnic, religious, racial. The use of those divisions to pit nations against each other and people within nations against each other is a classic means of maintaining control for the empire. That's what's breaking down right now under the leadership of the BRICS nations, in particular, what's happening with the Belt and Road Initiative and the Chinese extension of that from 2013 to the present as an international system. So when you look at this, what you see is that what the late Daniel Ellsberg called the covert empire run by the United States is being opposed by a growing number of nations. And I'll have a couple more things to say about the late Ellsberg, who just passed away a couple of days ago, that are quite relevant for this discussion. But this idea of a covert empire, which is not so covert if you live under its control, that's what's breaking down. And that's what people in the United States need to know, as well as people in Europe. Now, I want to just take two historic examples of an anti-colonial presidency. The first being Franklin Roosevelt, who had in 1941 through 43 a number of encounters with Winston Churchill, where the issue of the post-war period being an end to imperialism and end to colonialism was at the forefront of Roosevelt's list of things to do. Churchill didn't like that, obviously. There's the example of the January 1943 meeting in Casablanca, where Roosevelt arrived there by getting a tour of the British colony of Gambia, which he was just enraged by the conditions that he saw there, and he brought it up with Churchill. And he said that this is intolerable. We need to put an end to these kinds of imperial territories. And Churchill responded by saying, "I have not become the king's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." This discussion continued for the next couple of years. And after the Casablanca meeting, Roosevelt became more committed to the idea of the United Nations and making the United Nations a center of an anti-imperial world. He spoke, after he came back from the Casablanca meeting with Churchill, of the hopes of the colonies for independence after the war and an effort by nations to end imperialism. He complained to an aide in June 1943. He said, "We're getting nowhere with the British on colonial post-war policy." Now, at one point, FDR said to Churchill that colonies must be subject to international inspection. Churchill responded angrily and said, "We are not going to let any other nation inspect or report on conditions in British territory." And then again, after the Yalta Summit in 1945, shortly before his death, Roosevelt launched a very strong attack on the British and French empires and how these have to be ended as part of the negotiations at the end of the war. Now, John Kennedy, as Lyndon LaRouche always pointed out, was a Roosevelt Democrat. That is, he came from this Roosevelt tradition. There are other elements there that are complexities in looking at the character and the development of policy of John Kennedy. But I found a couple speeches that he gave in the U.S. Senate quite interesting. In 1951, as a congressman from Massachusetts, he made a trip to Vietnam as part of a fact-finding tour of a number of countries. And he was somewhat shocked by the conditions he saw there and the fact that the insurgency against the French was quite strong. Now, in April 1954, April 6, 1954, he gave a speech on the Senate floor. And it was on Vietnam. And he said he supported the idea of united action by nations to attain a victory for the free world in that area, meaning the defeat of communism. But then he made the following proviso. He said, to pour money, material, and men into the jungles of Indochina without at least a remote possibility of victory would be dangerously futile and self-destructive. And he said that the enemies that we're fighting are everywhere and have popular support, referring to Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. He went through a litany of quotes from diplomatic and military people from 1951 to 54, asserting that the French would win. There's no way they would lose the fight. All predicted a French victory. Now, keep in mind, his speech at the Senate was in April 1954. 1 month later, the French surrendered at Dien Bien Phu. and that was followed shortly afterwards by a pullout of Vietnam, leading to the division of Vietnam between North and South. Now, the other speech he gave, which is just reference, was in 1957 in the Senate, Imperialism, the Enemy of Freedom. And he said, American policy must be to support an end to colonialism in Africa and Asia, even if it damages relations with NATO allies France, Portugal, and Belgium, which indeed it did. He said in this speech, July 2nd, 1957, the single most important test for America is, quote, how we meet the challenge of imperialism, unquote. America, he said, shall be judged on how we meet this challenge. And at that time, he was talking about the importance of Algerian independence and the fact that the French say, well, Algeria is very happy with the French as a colony. And Kennedy said, the problem is no longer to save a myth of French empire. The problem is to save the French nation. Now, I'm bringing these examples up because what we see from John Kennedy in the June 10th speech is a sort of coming together of ideas that he had over many years, but when he became president, was unable to fulfill. When he first came into office, he was informed that Patrice Lumumba in the Congo had been assassinated. He was told that a ragtag band of Cubans would be supported by the CIA going into Cuba to overthrow the Castro government. And Kennedy stood up against that. He didn't stop it. But when the renegades were defeated on the shores of Cuba, Kennedy refused the demand of the war hawks to send U.S. military in to attack Cuba and overthrow Castro. A year later was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Kennedy resolved based on an understanding that there were interests that were in the Soviet Union similar to the interests of the military-industrial complex in the United States that were pushing for war, and that Khrushchev had to stand up against them as he had to stand up against his military hawks in order to get a solution. And in that context, facing nuclear war, it was through a renewed commitment for dialogue, negotiations, not just back channels, but using back channels to accomplish something, such as the passage of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in August of 1963, that showed that Kennedy was moving in that direction. And I've just written an article, which I won't go through now, but going through what Kennedy was doing between June 10th of 1963 and the time of his assassination to extricate the United States from Vietnam. Not true. He was sticking with the anti-communist Cold War policy. But if you look at the volume of material of both what he said to friends and political allies, as well as what he did, you come to an inescapable conclusion. He was committed to pulling out of Vietnam, but he was somewhat held back by the problem of the Cold War mentality, both of his own Warhawk faction, but also of the American population, which had been brainwashed into this Cold War thinking that we are going to have to sooner or later go to war with Russia. And so Kennedy, from June 10th to November 22nd, was pushing for a change in the policy. And military advisors, at the time there were 15,000, taking 1,000 of them out of Vietnam by the end of that year, and the whole contingent out by the end of 65. This was an incredible battle that he was waging. But he told people over and over that he's got to get through the 64 election. But once he does, we're out. Now, what I want to just come back to one aspect of the Ukraine situation, where we see this American imperial, what Ellsberg called the covert empire, engaging in a war against Russia for no purpose other than to protect the privilege of being the global hegemon. which is the United States. The British are directly tied to them, and the whole NATO alliance is a part of that. And if this global hegemon is allowed to continue this war, it's not going to end, even if they defeated the Russians, which is highly unlikely, but will continue against China and against any other nation that rejects this neo-colonial status that Putin has declared has ended. Now, in this context, I want to conclude by just bringing up a statement Daniel Ellsberg made 10 days after it became publicly known that he had released the Pentagon Papers. In June of 1971, Ellsberg delivered to several media, as well as a number of congressmen, the 7,000 pages of documents that he had covertly smuggled out of his office at the Rand Corporation, which were called the Pentagon Papers, which were compiled by McNamara, which included the reporting by the military of what was going on in Vietnam. And Ellsberg, on studying these, had become a dedicated opponent of that war. But he saw the only way to fight it would be to release these documents. And so that's how the Pentagon Papers came into existence. Now, 10 days after their release, on June 23rd, 1971, he had an interview with Walter Cronkite on CBS News. And listen to what he said, because I think you'll find that this is absolutely what we're facing with today's military-industrial complex in Ukraine. Ellsberg said, he was asked to summarize what's in the documents, and he said, they show, quote, that our officials never did concern themselves with the effect of our policies on the Vietnamese, unquote. Never concerned themselves with what was happening to the Vietnamese. Isn't that what's going on in Ukraine right now? We talk about the heroic courage of the Ukrainian fighters as they're being mowed down in horrible numbers. We talk about the bravery of Zelensky, who's essentially a mouthpiece for NATO. We talk about the war for freedom, but there's no freedom for the Ukrainians. They're under the dictatorship of the International Monetary Fund. They're surviving as a nation only because of money being poured into them from the United States and the NATO allies. Remember what Kennedy said about Vietnam. He said, and I'll repeat this because it's worth noting, he said, to pour money, material, and men into the jungles of Indochina without at least a remote possibility of victory would be dangerously futile and self-destructive. And he said that in 1954. I think you take that statement with the Ellsberg statement from the time of the release of the papers of not being concerned with the interests of the Vietnamese, and you see that we continue to have these policies dictated by a small group of an establishment which refuses to bend in the face of the possible thermonuclear war. The important thing to note, though, is what Putin said. The move toward a new global development system is unstoppable, it's inevitable, and it's taking place. The question is, will we in the West have the brains and the courage to join the global South to overturn the dictatorship of the City of London and Wall Street and bring together the kind of world of peace that John Kennedy spoke about in his June 10th speech? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Harley. And before we go on, if you just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's discussion by a Manhattan Town Meeting, which is a discussion of the conference that we held last week called The World Needs JFK's Vision of Peace. And we just heard from Harley Schlanger, spokesman for the LaRouche organization, who participated in that conference. What I want to do at this point is to play an exchange which Harley conveyed between Helga Zepp-LaRouche and one of the people that had seen that JFK American University speech and was asking a question to Helga about how he and others might use it with younger generations.
Now, Helga, we can start with some of the early questions that came in, most of which are related to that dialogue, concerns about how to organize to address the crises facing mankind today. Let me start with one from someone from Ohio who sent the question, listening to JFK's June 10th speech brings out strong emotions in older Americans like me, but young people have no connection or little connection to the Kennedy presidency. What advice can you give us about how to make it meaningful to people under 50?
Well, I think that, the more people who are a witness of that period of the Kennedy time, for whom it does mean a lot, get active and, just spread it to every young person you know. I think that would help a great deal. And, I think if we would get some courageous youth who have actually taken the intellectual adventure, so to speak, to look at this, I think it could really become viral, because, what Kennedy said and what is expressed in this American University speech and many other speeches he gave, it's almost like from a different universe, or at least a different star, a different planet. It's so different than anything what you can hear from the politicians today, because he had a clear idea of a vision for peace, not only just for America, but peace for the world, peace for all times. And I think, right now where the world is on the verge of World War III, and there are many people extremely aware of it, and more people get organized for it. And this is one of the reasons why, many people think of internationalizing the peace movement, which, we have done with the International Peace Coalition. But, if you look at it, we have now the largest air maneuver in the history of NATO. This is extremely dangerous. I mean, we are sitting on a complete powder keg where 250 fighter jets, just imagine an armada of 250 fighter jets are every day now flying over Germany, flying up to the Russian border via up all the way to Estonia or to Romania. And that is, some of them potentially are nuclear capable fighter jets. Now just put yourself in the position of the Russian reconnaissance, who are already watching a hot war in Ukraine, where, in the recent period, many incursions have happened into the Russian territory. So they have to be on the top super alert because of that. And then you have these maneuvers which assume the attack of a country with a strong air force, air power has already occurred. Now that, puts the whole situation on an extremely super tense level. And one little mistake by a pilot or some misreading, of what the intention is of a certain action, and you could have an uncontrollable escalation. I find it completely irresponsible to hold this maneuver, which apparently was planned since 2018, but is now taking place in the context of a hot war in the middle of Europe. And to have such a maneuver, which is already provocative because of the basis, the scenario on which it's based. So I think, many people are concerned with that. And, the speech by Kennedy and what he actually represents, he had a vision which, is now actually potentially becoming true, because the war danger is one thing, but on the other side, you have a historic process going on, which the Western media are absolutely not reporting. And if they're reporting it, they are reporting it as a threat or as a slander. But the vast majority of the world, the global South countries, 151 nations, are forming a new world economic order. And, everything you're reading in the media or hearing in the media about Russia being isolated, it's ridiculous. Today was the opening of the St. Petersburg Annual Economic Forum, where more than 100 countries had delegates, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, practically every part of the world had large delegations and high-ranking people. So then you just had a very important, the 10th meeting between the Arabs and China, and they concluded deals for, I think, over $10 billion. And, there is a completely new orientation. The energy minister of Saudi Arabia was asked how he responds to demands coming from the Western countries not to have dealings with Russia and China. And he said, well, I just ignore it. So, we are in the most incredible transformation of history. Most people are not aware of it, but that doesn't mean, most people in the West are not aware of it, but that doesn't mean it's not taking place. So Kennedy, in a certain sense, bridges that because, in his speech 60 years ago, he had a vision of the kind of world which is now emerging. So for people in the United States, or for Europe for that matter, because Kennedy was very liked, in Germany, for example, people were completely enthusiastic about Kennedy. It bridges a paradigm which went under with the assassination of Kennedy and the cover-up of his murder by the Warren Commission, and the 60 years, or almost 60 years, which happened since, and it bridges the world which is now emerging. So I can only say, if you are of the age that you do have that it registers with you what the difference was, go out and organize, join the Schiller Institute, join the International Peace Coalition, and tell people about it. Because our campaign to focus on the Kennedy paradigm is not over, because, we have a campaign going where we are appealing to the president or the next president of the United States to return to the era of Kennedy, because that is the kind of America the world urgently needs and wants.
You've just heard Helga LaRouche, a founder and head of the Schiller Institute, commenting about how critical she believes the discussion of the American University speech of JFK is to the present day. Now, this is a matter of great concern to everybody around the world, particularly in the entire transatlantic sector. Too often, in fact, Americans and sometimes people outside of America think about what's going on in America as either the most important thing in the world or completely insularly. It just, it has to do with something about internal American politics and American elections and so on and so forth. Nothing can be further than the truth. You just heard Helga describe the NATO maneuvers that are ongoing and which threaten or could, in fact, be another kind of trigger for an escalation of the present conflict that has been unfolding for the past year and more. Recently, one of the leaders of Europe, former President Silvio Berlusconi of Italy, Prime Minister of Italy, died, and there was a significant concern about how that development might affect discussions, more rational discussions about what to do. And also in our last week's conference, there were a couple of questions, including some allusion to possible connections between the assassination of President Kennedy in November of 1963 and certain parallel developments that were happening in Italy and in other parts of Europe at the time. And to discuss these things, to sort of take these up both then and now, we've asked that Claudio Celani from Executive Intelligence Review and our European desk there join us, and he's here with us today. Welcome, Claudio. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, you said it last week, the former Prime Minister of Italy, Silvio Berlusconi, passed away. And I think a few people were shocked, other people less shocked, when just yesterday the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, asked the participants to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum that Helga just mentioned, where representatives from more than 100 nations were Well, Putin asked them to stand up and make 1 minute of silence in honor of Silvio Berlusconi. Now, Putin had sent a message to the Italian state president a few days before, and published a statement on the website of the Russian presidency. And also he had given an interview to Russian TV where he said that Silvio Berlusconi, whom he had known very well, met several times, many times in the past years, he considered him to be a real patriot, a man who always defended the interests of his country. And I think in the interview with the Russian TV, he also specified that it was thanks to Berlusconi that in 2004 the NATO Council, and indeed this is true, it was during the rotating chairmanship of the G7, which Italy had that year, and Berlusconi was prime minister, and he prepared this summit very well, working a lot with the aim of achieving an approachment, a détente between the United States and Russia, and between the two presidents. It was George W. Bush at that time and Putin, and he was successful. And there is a photograph showing George W. Bush and Putin shaking hands in Italy. The G7 became the G8 for that occasion, and the NATO-Russia Council was established. So things looked like going into the good direction of cooperation between the United States, Europe, and Russia. But then all this changed. Now Berlusconi, he was a colorful character. Maybe you can say he was a little Trump ante litteram, before Trump. A tycoon who suddenly decides to enter politics. And he had, private colored life, many women, and the way he would approach the media and speak was a little bit besides the protocol. But if you look at what he did in foreign policy, which includes what I just said, but many other things, like he made a treaty with India, which is very important because we have discussed about decolonization, and the treaty that he did in 2010 was unprecedented, where Italy recognized the mistakes which the country had done in the past by colonizing Libya, asking for forgiveness and deciding to invest in a development program to remedy for the mistakes of the past, building a highway, building hospitals, residential houses, etc. So this was 1 year before NATO bombed Libya. But compared to the other politicians on the scene today, and not only Italy, Europe, he was a giant. Despite all the problems in economic policy, also there were problems, but on strategic policy. And when he died, people close to him in his last hours then told the media that he was more afraid of a nuclear war than his sickness. He died of leukemia, of blood cancer, and he knew he had it. He had been hospitalized 1 month earlier. He had been 4 weeks in hospital for treatment of leukemia and of pneumonia. So he came out, and then it didn't last 1 month until he was again hospitalized and died with 86. So he was working at a peace plan. Now we know this. It was secret. He didn't tell anybody, but he was working at a peace plan. And at one point, he went to his parliamentary faction of his party and gave a briefing to them, a closed-door briefing on foreign policy. This was a few months ago, where he said that the responsibility for the war in Ukraine lies in what happened in Kiev in 2014 when there was a coup for the elected president, and then somebody came in power in Kiev who was anti-Russian and started to discriminate all the Russians, especially in the Donbass. And then they started, as the Donbass tried to get independent, then they deployed the army and started to bomb the Donbass. So this went on for 8 years, killing thousands of people. And at that point, Russia had no other choice than intervene. So he said all this to the parliamentary faction, and he said there is no solution except these countries in the Donbass and Crimea must become independent, and somebody, a decent person, must replace that guy in Kiev, that guy being Zelensky. Now, be aware, he was saying this leader of a governing party in Italy. Italy has a parliamentary system with a coalition government made out of 3 parties. The larger party is called Fratelli d'Italia. It's a right-wing party, and the premier, Giorgia Meloni, is the leader of this party. They have then as partner, you have Berlusconi's party, Forza Italia, who used to be a large party, but now they have about 10%. And then the third coalition partner is the Lega, led by Matteo Salvini. So you must understand, Berlusconi was saying this, being member of a party which is on the international scene in Europe, in NATO, among the most hawkish pro-Ukraine governments, giving weapons, giving money, supporting sanctions, and so on. So, not caring about the repercussions on the government. He wanted this to come out to give a signal to Moscow. So now we know that he was working to a peace plan, which is very important. And he said either somebody in the party picks this up, or Vatican has to pick up my proposal for a peace in the Ukraine. So the other thing which you asked me to talk about is somehow related, because what Berlusconi cannot be compared with the figure of Enrico Mattei. Mattei was the person who took responsibility after the end of the war to build a system of energy independence for Italy. And he had been a partisan leader. He was the leader of the Catholic Christian partisan organizations. And then he was, after the war, to liquidate Italy's energy company. And then he made something very different. And then he became not only the most powerful man in Italy, but he became an internationally recognized leader for independence and fight against colonialism. Mattei has quite a different moral stature than Berlusconi, so you cannot really put them the same level. But if we look at the struggle for independence, for the freedom from the, certainly there are some connections. We can say connections, analogies to Kennedy. Mattei was killed on the 27th of October 1962, 1 year before Kennedy was killed. He was killed in a plane accident, and it took many years, actually decades, before it was established that this was no accident, but it was a bomb placed into his plane, which exploded, and therefore it was an assassination. But the similarity starts here. The similarity starts exactly here, because the moment his plane crashed in the vicinity of Milan before landing on that evening on the 27th of October, from that moment on, a cover-up was organized. So in the United States, we had the Warren Commission. In Italy, they appointed a commission led not by a judge, but by an Air Force general. Now, why an Air Force general? Well, because this guy did not have the task. His mission was not to find the truth, but to cover up the truth. And this was a very, very important period, the end of October 1962. We are in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Something that could come up and say, oh, they killed Enrico Mattei, the most powerful man in Italy. And the guy who was going to meet Kennedy in a few days, at the beginning of November, his meeting with Kennedy had been planned. And this is extremely important. And Mattei's fight for independence of African countries and Middle East countries then would have joined with Kennedy's will for the same thing. And this would have become quite a powerful international enterprise. Now, just to give an example, Mattei started to look for oil very early after the end of the war, because Italy, is a country which very little raw materials, very poor from the standpoint of raw materials, a little bit of coal somewhere, but very little. And nobody had any idea whether some oil or gas in the underground. So he started to look for oil, and then he immediately discovered that you couldn't get oil except you go to the famous Seven Sisters, which are the 7 multinational oil companies, mostly Anglo-Dutch and French companies, and among them also a couple of American oil companies like Standard Oils, etc. And then they said, no, Mr. Mattei, you don't get oil. If you want to have oil, then you buy it from us. Mattei said, look, can't you make me a partner? I have the skills, I have the technology, I can help you to find more oil. Says, no partnership. So Mattei tried then to get direct deals with developing countries like Iran. And he would go out there and make a deal, and then the next day, who knows what, the government was toppled and the deal was cancelled. And then he got angry. He got angry, then he started to go to oil-producing countries offering a better deal. Instead of the 50-50 share of the royalties, right? If we get $100, then says the oil company, you producing countries, you get 50, and we get the other 50, right? The Mattei said, no, well, I give you 75, and I keep 25. Not only that, but I will develop your skills to get the oil out. I will train your labor force, etc. But not only this, he started to finance and support liberation movements, and especially in Algeria. He started to finance and support the Algerian liberation movement. Now, at that time, we are in the 60s now, and Mattei had become already, from the standpoint of financial power, very powerful, because the Italian oil company which he had founded, had discovered gas in Italy. So in waiting for oil, he started to develop gas. And in a very short time, he built gas pipelines throughout the country, and he supplied the industry with gas and households also with gas. So he became quite powerful. His allies in the Christian Democratic government also backed him. The state president was a friend of him. The British got very, very afraid of Mattei, and especially because he was doing this, he was financing liberation movements. So he was going to meet Kennedy. I know this because one day I met one of Mattei's former collaborators, the late Benito Livigni. Livigni was a scout for Mattei's company Eni in Sicily. And he told me that when Mattei went last to Sicily, they met, and Mattei told Livigni that he had succeeded in arranging a meeting with President Kennedy, and he would soon go to the United States. He would meet Kennedy, he would get honoris causa university degree somewhere, maybe Harvard, and this then would have very important political implications internationally. So I started then to look a little bit more into this, and especially I started to look into, how Kennedy would look at Mattei, because it was really known about it, that there had been contacts at all or whatever. Then I discovered what probably most of you know, but that Kennedy, before becoming president, he had been really involved in the issue of colonialism. He had been the chairman of the Senate subcommittee on African matters, and he was totally dedicated to the cause of anti-colonialism. So Mattei dies, and the commission is established. The commission conducted its investigation and concludes that this was an incident, an accident. There was no other explanation. There was raining, strong raining that evening. The pilot made some mistakes, and then the plane crashed. Now, it took decades before the truth came out, and this happened after we made a conference in Milan in 1992. This was the 30th anniversary of Mattei's death. We organized quite an important conference, and we published also the records of this conference. I have it here. You can see this. You see the historical example of Enrico Mattei conference. Oh, the date is here. You can see it. No. And at this conference, among the other things, Helga was the head of the Partisans Association, which Mattei had founded and of came. His name was Raffaele Morini, and he told us that he had kept some debris of Mattei's plane in the hope that someday some independent, honest prosecutor would open a serious investigation. Now, after this conference, he went to the prosecutor in Pavia, to the prosecutor name is Vincenzo Calia, and brought his deed. The prosecutor did start an investigation, and with modern methods, they analyzed this debris and they found traces of explosive. So they concluded with scientific proof that there was a bomb in the landing gear of Mattei's plane, and this bomb exploded as the landing gear was started just before landing. So now we know it, and nobody can say that Mattei died in an accident. So the question is, who killed him? Cui prodest or cui bono? Well, there are some investigative leads which connect the machine that killed Mattei maybe to the machine that killed Kennedy, and that's the presence of a New Orleans mafia basically days before Mattei was there, and then took off with his plane from the airport of Catania to reach Milan that evening on the 27th of October. So the bomb was placed in the airport, at the airport in Catania, certainly. A few days before, there was this guy from New Orleans, was Carlos Marcello. He was the mafia boss of New Orleans, and he's connected to the people whom Prosecutor Garrison did on the Kennedy assassination. He's connected to David Ferry, and he's connected to the World Trade Center organization, which is also mentioned by Garrison. But I think the political analysis of the assassination of Mattei and why he was assassinated also give us an answer and a similarity to Kennedy's assassination. It lies in this, in the fact that Mattei and Kennedy were the two enemies of the world colonial system. Of the British Empire, we can say certainly, because the British Empire was threatened in its power by decolonization. And recently, a friend of mine, a journalist named Fasanella, he went to look into British archives and wrote several books finding out documents and diplomatic dispatches of that period, and he found some very interesting ones written by the British embassy in Rome to their bosses in Britain on Mattei and on what Mattei was doing in the Middle East and in North Africa. And at one point they ring really the alarm bell, because Mattei was concluding a deal in Iraq, and this was being as totally unacceptable. He was threatening British interests there, and that's what the people say. They say that in a few days, I think a couple of days before Mattei was killed, the Financial Times published an article with the headline, "Mr. Mattei must go." So we have seen, in the case of Kennedy, this can also be documented. And I wrote an article a few years ago on entitled "Mattei Kennedy, the alliance killed by the British," an alliance that unfortunately could never be materialized. So the lessons for us today is the vision of Kennedy, the vision of Mattei is what we have to relaunch today, is the solution to the crisis we are living it. I forgot to mention that Mattei also was very interested in the non-aligned movement, which was developing at that time. And this is also a very actual issue today. So I think I should stop here, because maybe there are questions and I can then answer questions.
Well, thank you very much, Claudio. That was Claudio Celani from the Executive Intelligence Review Europe. And you already indicated some areas where you and Harley would actually discuss some areas of convergence. What we're going to do is go to Professor Cliff Kiracofe, president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development, a congressional staffer for many years, and also a participant in several of our conferences. And he's been here on the LaRouche organization platform several times. So Cliff, having heard what you've heard and otherwise having a chance to think over the significance of Kennedy and the American University speech, begin wherever you wish and take whatever time you need and tell us what you think.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis, and hi, Claudio. And thank everyone for watching. A couple of points I would just start out with, and I won't make a long discussion here, but the Kennedy speech in 1957 that Harley brought forward is very significant. And the idea that President Kennedy represented a political orientation in the United States Senate, Congress, against imperialism. And and also Harley remarked that that tied into President Franklin Roosevelt's tradition of anti-imperialism. The point I would make on that is that, well, the American Revolution itself was an anti-imperial revolution. And so our founding fathers were anti-imperialist. We were oppressed colonies fighting for independence from the British Empire at that time, the financial domination, economic domination of the city and London, etc. So the American tradition was expressed, for example, in George Washington's farewell address and his concepts of good relations around the world where we could. And that is expressed by other American founding fathers, John Quincy. So the original ethos with respect to foreign policy of this republic, beginning in 1789 and all that, was for peace, peaceful relations with foreign countries, and equal countries were equal, a concept of equality among nations. So a profound commitment to international law as it had developed over the centuries, from the 17th century, even earlier, the 16th century, the Spanish, and 17th century Grotius and all. So the United States' early years as a republic were firmly grounded in concerns for upholding international law and a non-imperialistic foreign policy. Now that changed in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, and this resulted in American colonialism. We still have a colony. It's called Puerto Rico and Guam, etc. So we did, after 3 years, let Cuba go, but we retained the Philippines until after World War II. So the United States, under the influence of Wall Street, which means, of course, finance capitalism, became an imperialist power. We can use the Spanish-American War, 1898, as a marker, as a landmark for Wall Street's promoting and pushing the United States government into imperialism. And this was directed, of course, more toward Asia at the time, Philippines, et cetera, and a little bit in the Caribbean with Cuba. At any rate, I just want to make the point then that the American Revolution was anti-imperialist, and we ourselves were oppressed colonies from 1607 down to 1776. So we were oppressed colonies for 150 some years. The Chinese make a point of their years of 150 years of oppression under a foreign domination. Well, we also have 150 years or more of foreign domination as colonies. The international system is, of course, changing today, and it is irreversible, as President Putin has pointed out. U.S. hegemony has ended, actually, although some may feel it lingers a bit, but U.S. hegemony has ended. Now, let's go back a little bit to 1991-92, when the Soviet Union broke up. At that point, the United States had a choice in its foreign policy and foreign relations. The United States could have realized, okay, the bipolar world is over, the Soviet Union no longer exists, so let's work toward a multipolar world and good, peaceful relations with the world. Also, let's take a breather here and recover our economy, because we spent so much on the military-industrial complex during the Cold War years. So let's recover from the Cold War years and work on our economy, improve people's lives at home here, and improve our infrastructure, improve our businesses, technology, science, public health, and so on. But that road really was not taken. The unipolar concept came out toward the end of the George W. Bush administration and Cheney and that whole gang of neoconservatives. So the United States, the so-called unipolar moment, and some people would say that translates to the hegemonism or hegemonism. Hegemonism meaning trying to dominate the planet, hegemony over the planet. And that would be an aspect of finance capitalism as the main mechanism, backed up by military power, which would be NATO, and various covert actions, assassinations, etc., around the world, third world and whatever back in the day, Africa, Middle East, etc. So the United States then, when the Soviet Union broke up, did not take the opportunity to go multipolar or think about going multipolar. Instead, we forged ahead on a unipolar mode. Now, today, however, as was pointed out by Helga and others, the BRICS movement and many other interesting regional organizations and development banks and so on have organized themselves and are coming together. And as was pointed out, over 100 countries were at the St. Petersburg conference. So if anything, the United States is isolated. If you take a look at the UN voting patterns, about 140 members usually vote against the United States when it has an unacceptable resolution. The United States can count on maybe 50 votes at the UN, but the majority of the world population, majority of countries, 140 countries, vote against the United States when it brings up unacceptable resolutions and the like in the United Nations. So if anything, the United States is becoming more and more isolated. At the same time, Washington and the foreign policy elite are in a situation where they never, back in the 91, 92, thought about preparing for multipolarity. They wanted unipolarity. And again, they haven't given unipolarity or hegemonism up yet. But in the face of a changing world, at some point, the international situation will force the United States to change its ways. The Ukraine war may well be a landmark on that road. I would say that the danger of world war, Helga pointed out that, is increasing. Danger of even nuclear war is increasing. We're coming to a situation now in the Ukraine war where we need to keep an eye on the battlefield. It appears that Russia is making significant wins on the battlefield, and Ukraine is, what's left of Ukraine is somewhat an exhausted rump state of some kind. Its borders have yet to be determined. The NATO is meeting in July 10, 12, I think it is, in Vilnius, Lithuania. And at that point, it will be interesting to see what NATO decides to do. If they decide to escalate the war against Russia, that can certainly lead to a European-wide war, which then can escalate into the world war that Helga had mentioned earlier. And that also was pointed out that Mr. Berlusconi, the late Mr. Berlusconi, was concerned about nuclear war and world war. So the Kennedy speech reflected and reflects the traditional attitude and posture of the United States with regard to the family of nations, the community of nations, the international community. However, as I mentioned, certain circles, the Wall Street types and the we could call globalists, there are many terms for these people, the elite, the ruling class, ruling circles, whatever sorts of adjectives we want to toss out. But at any rate, this globalist elite is in firm control of Congress and very firm control of the White House. So essentially, we're an occupied country. We're recolonized by the globalists, British, Wall Street, etc. So we're back facing a situation of oppression, and it's becoming more Orwellian because technology is enabling more government surveillance and so on. So we're at a critical moment because of the Ukraine situation, and a variant of that is, will the Ukraine situation leading to a further conflict, would that trigger something in Asia? Taiwan, would the United States want to trigger a war in Asia? And Blinken and the company are working overtime to pull Japan and the Philippines and so on, South Korea, into sort of an anti-China alignment, and then link that up with Australia and so on. So we also have to keep our eyes on Taiwan and Asia as a flashpoint. In political science, in foreign policy, international relations, there's in the past have been a series of what's called power transition. And in a situation of power transition, the hegemonic power, which is in decline, is about to be or being surpassed by another power or coalition of powers. And in some cases, the hegemonic power that's losing power in decline will lash out. And certainly we can see this Ukraine war as part of that lashing out against Russia, trying to counter any rivals, et cetera, et cetera. So the question for the U.S. foreign policy elite, the ruling circles, ruling class, et cetera, the question is, are they going to push for a broader European war and a global war or not? And I think in the coming short period of time, we'll see some indications of the July meeting of NATO. And then later in August, I think it's August 22nd, there's a meeting, a BRICS meeting, et cetera. And we can see if there's a new currency or a new financial situation developing or being implemented in August, and that could certainly trigger a crisis of confidence in the U.S. dollar, depending on how it goes, the so-called alternative currencies and de-dollarization and all of that. So that again is a potential inflection point for crisis. And the U.S. foreign policy elite, the ruling circles in the United States, et cetera, are no doubt quite nervous about this and don't want to make a hard decision to go multipolar. They want to maintain the hegemony and stay unipolar. What our task is to try to convince the powers that be that it's much smarter for the United States as a republic to have a sustainable long-term future, worth looking forward to adopt a multipolar outlook, to adopt a peace outlook, to adopt the kind of foreign policy that President Kennedy was talking about. His American University address. Quite a beautiful sentiments there. Well, I'll conclude with that and look forward to discussion.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Cliff. So we're going to try to bring everybody up. We're having a few technical problems a bit with people's connections, although so far everything's been preserved. Jose, if you're able to bring everybody up on the screen, very good. And we'll do our best here. Now, Harley, first we're going to come back to you and see if you have any responses to what you've heard. Since there are some various areas, there are several questions, and I want to get to them as quickly as we can. And there's also another feature. There was a discussion that appeared in RT today, Russia Today, which at some point we'll get to, but we're not going to start with that. Let's start with you first, Harley, and anything that you have to say.
Okay, well, I'll just respond to something that Cliff brought up at the end about how you change the situation. I'm not sure that if Antony Blinken had the attention span to listen to our discussion, it would make a difference with him. I think the ruling elite are delusional, in some cases perhaps in a lunatic way. That is, there's no reason there, no access to reason. And they're going to continue to push for what they think is right. And they're going to use censorship. They're going to use irregular warfare to continue to do that. But that's precisely why we've established an international peace coalition. We've got to pull together in the United States and Europe those people who are not delusional, who may not think they have the power to change the government thinking, but who can join us in mobilizing in the population what might be a survival impetus. That is, if people want to survive, we have to change the policy. And part of that is to, in the United States and Europe, get people to understand that the enemies that we face are not the Russian government, the Russian people, Vladimir Putin, or the Chinese. That they're doing what we should be doing, which is moving to address the crises of poverty, of pandemics, of war, of lack of energy, lack of clean water. That I think it was a Chinese official who said, the most important human right is the eradication of poverty. And that's what the intent is of the BRICS, of the discussion that just took place in St. Petersburg. And what we have to do is, as Helga said in the clip you saw earlier, bring an awareness of this to the people of our countries, that there is a potential for change. In fact, change is occurring. And what's deadly is if we stick to the policies that have been proven to be wrong and dangerous and disastrous, because we're afraid that if we step out of line, we'll somehow end up being threatened. So that's what I would say, that as Putin said, this neo-colonial system is gone. We can create a new system, and a new system not under the control of the existing financial forces in the world, but one which is beneficial to all people in cooperation with all nations.
Okay, now for reasons of time, what I'm going to do is go right to questions, and anything that either Cliff, you, or Claudio, you have to add or respond to, please do that in that context. But you'll see what will happen. So if the question is directed to a particular individual, I will do that, but otherwise anybody can jump in and answer. The first question is from Karen, and she says, in John Kennedy's commencement speech, for the first time in history, a leader of a major world power raised with his people the concept of negotiating disarmament of the weapons, and especially the nuclear weapons, which, as he said, one weapon had greater explosive power than all the Allied weapons in World War II. He continued to show our good faith in negotiations for a test ban treaty. Quote, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve one. Nor would such a treaty be a substitute for disarmament, but I hope it will help us achieve it. End quote. To the best of my knowledge, we haven't discussed this aspect of his speech, but I believe this is what made it more rapidly known than otherwise. Can you comment on this element of his address now? Let me just indicate before we go into that actually there were back and forth, back channel discussions between Khrushchev and Kennedy that had been going on from November of 1962. And one of the problems had become that Khrushchev was unable, because of Kennedy's attempts to insist on 20 plus verifications, the sites for verification. Khrushchev did not feel he could negotiate that. They were back and forth about that. He went down to 8, then there was a question of getting to 3, and so I'm only indicating those things just so it's understood that there was an intensive discussion process that involved both of them, which was rather hot. I'll put it like that. At one point, Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy, and he said this: "Evil has brought some good. The good is that now people have felt more tangibly the burning flames of thermonuclear war and have a more clear realization of the threat looming over them if the arms race is not stopped." So that's the kind of thing they were saying. And Kennedy was said to, in April of '63, to Norman Cousins, one of the ironic things about this entire situation is that Mr. Khrushchev and I occupy approximately the same political positions inside our governments. He would like to prevent a nuclear war, but is under severe pressure from his hardline crowd. I've got similar problems. The hardliners in the Soviet Union and the United States feed on one another, each using the actions of the other to justify his own position. That's also a quote. That's from Kennedy. So, anybody want to take this up? No? Leave it alone? Okay, go ahead, Cliff.
Well, it's a good question. And I think the key point here is the problem of the militarization of U.S. foreign policy. Rather than taking a diplomatic approach. As you just mentioned, Dennis, President Kennedy was engaged in what we could call personal diplomacy at the highest level with Khrushchev. Keeping the lines of communication open, being frank, and conducting a personal diplomacy. Meanwhile, you had various elements of our government and diplomatic corps, etc., ready to back up the president. The problem in the United States since World War II and the Cold War is the militarization of U.S. foreign policy. President Eisenhower alluded to and warned about the military-industrial complex in his farewell speech. The key to the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, which actually is still going on, was the so-called memorandum by the National Security Council, NSC 68. And you can Google NSC 68 and read about it. But it was written in April, put together in April of 1950. And basically, it was the ultra-hawkish point of view about fighting the Soviet Union and communism, China, etc. So that NSC 68 was the basis of American Cold War foreign policy down into the 90s, and basically it's been, you could say, revived. NSC 68 was mainly drafted by a person called Paul Nitze, who is a controversial figure, and it was a banker for Schroeder's Bank and other banking interests in New York, and became a public figure, etc. So NSC 68 then, and you can Google it, is a vital national security document indicating the Cold War mindset of the American foreign policy elite and decision makers in Washington, D.C. So what we have to do today is emphasize the diplomacy side of things, just like President Kennedy was trying to do, emphasize diplomacy. But as Dennis pointed out, Blinken, who's fundamentally incompetent, that's a great worry. It should be to all Americans that at the moment we have a very incompetent government. The President of the United States, as we can see daily, is not well, let's put it that way. And Blinken and Newland and the various persons in this administration lack competence and gravitas even in foreign affairs. So I include Sullivan as well, that fellow, at the NSC. So as a republic, we are facing an international crisis. There's a war in Ukraine that we created, and we have a very incompetent national leadership. And the problem also is, and I worked in the Senate for 11 years, I served on the Foreign Relations Committee as a professional staff member. The lack of confidence in Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. And the Peace Party, we can say, in Congress is just a handful of people in the House, and maybe a few people in the Senate. But the Congress is all hawks. So we have a situation where it doesn't make much difference between the two parties, Democrats and Republicans, The real problem we have is trying to create a peace party to counter the war hawks in both of the traditional parties. So I think it's an excellent question, and I think the issue is the militarization of foreign policy needs to be stopped. Eisenhower warned about that. Kennedy obviously was listening to Ike on that. And we need to call for immediate process of negotiations and diplomacy with respect, for example, to the Ukraine crisis. The United States has blocked diplomacy on Ukraine. Boris Johnson blocked diplomacy last year that the Turkish president, Erdogan, was trying to implement with respect to the Ukraine war. So this blocking of diplomacy by our State Department and other foreign capitals, that includes London, Paris, and also Berlin, blocking the Minsk Accords, etc. So we have to unblock diplomacy and encourage a peace process.
Okay, this is a question which I'm going to largely direct at, well, you'll see why. I mean, we'll go to Claudio as well as Harley. This comes from Hisham. He says, hello. First, I would like to thank Harley for highlighting the fact that Kennedy was very active in supporting Algeria's independence. This made JFK extremely hated by the colonialist terrorist organization called the OAS, which had direct ties to the covert network that targeted JFK, de Gaulle, and Enrico Mattei, named Permindex. Last weekend, Dennis seemed a bit surprised when I mentioned that the LaRouche organization had identified this covert network. I mentioned the work of Jeffrey Steinberg and Anton Chaikin on this topic. Claudio Celani has also done an outstanding research on this. He states that EIR and publications associated with Lyndon LaRouche have amply exposed the Permindex connection and followed that connection to the broader geopolitical conspiracy run out of London. It would be great to have Claudio shed some more light on this topic today. So this is sort of a, I was not surprised for various reasons, which are rather obvious. I did not bring this up last week, and we now bring it up here. So, Claudio, why don't you get us started?
Well, I mean, yeah, the OIS, the mafia, the British, the CIA, we have to have a political analysis in which we all, it's difficult. Let's put it this way. It's difficult to reach a judiciary truth on all these things. Almost impossible, because destabilizations, we are talking about destabilizations, right? The assassination of Kennedy, the assassination of Mattei, the attempted assassination of de Gaulle. These are organized in such a way to make it almost impossible to find the judiciary truth, because they are organized together with the cover-up of the investigation. So we have seen it in the case of Kennedy, and we've seen it in the case of Mattei too. The persons who were involved in the material execution of these plots, they are no longer around. It would be interesting to find out what is in the archive. So therefore, it's important, for example, that the US archives are published. They are not. There must be a reason why they're not published. And I think Trump said, I had to look into it and I understood why they didn't want to publish them. If I'm not wrong, it was Trump, right? And on the other side, the work which I mentioned before by Giovanni Fasanella and Mario Cereghino, who is his archivist friend, in the last years in London, where you can find a lot of stuff in the archives, this is incredibly valuable to establish, again, not the judiciary truth, but the political truth of what was going on, right? And see who are the interests and the power that moves behind the scenes and organizes such assassinations. I think personally that it would be very interesting to look in London for documents in archives concerning Kennedy. Has anyone done this? The British Foreign Office dispatches by MI6 residents in Washington, in New York, etc. I don't think nobody has done this. This would, I think, would give us tremendous surprises. So the question is, however, the continuity of the political fight is evident. We are living now the continuity of the fight that Kennedy lost because he was assassinated, that Mattei lost because he was also killed and was assassinated, that the West has been losing since the fall of the Berlin Wall because what Cliff called the globalists have taken over. So what we are seeing now is a rollover of all the conquests of decolonization, of the fight against imperialism, which were successful under Eisenhower and under Kennedy as well. And they're now being rolled back. So what we have now, we have the former colonial powers who are building a new form of empire, which is no longer an empire with a flag, a national flag, like would have been the British Empire, but it's a supranational empire. One part of this is, for example, the EU, the European Union. Now look at who controls the European Union. Ask yourself why the European Commission and the European Union is the most hawkish, anti-Russian, anti-China agency at this point. And now look at their agenda, look at their international economic policy agenda, and there you find, you discover what is it all about. They want to take over again control of the south of the world, of their former colonies. They want to break up Russia. They want to delusionary want to stop the development of China. They want to break Europe from China. They want to break the rest of the world from China. That's their agenda, and they do this under the name of saving the planet, because that's the most, the biggest threat we are facing is climate change. We have to save the planet, so we have to enforce Green Deal. We have to, decarbonize. We have to stop eating meat. We have to stop making agriculture. We have to stop producing plastic, blah, 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 blah. So this is a blueprint for decolonization. And so that's the continuity. And these people are, walking corpses, if need be, to implement their plans. The era of political assassination is not over. We must be careful. We must be aware that these people have the capability, and they would use it if they think it's necessary. On the positive side, let me put some positive element into the picture. We must not be demoralized if by organizing, we see, a response of the population which is brainwashed by the media, and it's hard for them to believe what the truth is, because they are bombarded every day by the media, who tell them the narrative of the Western democracy against authoritarianism, Russia's war of aggression, Putin's idea of rebuilding the Russian Empire, China's hegemonic plan for the world, etc., etc. Our organizers meet this every day in the streets, and I tell you just one anecdote. If I take 5 more minutes, but yesterday there was an interesting performance of Verdi's Aida, at the arena in Verona. Now, the arena in Verona, if you know, this is a huge Roman amphitheater with a very good acoustic. So in terms of venues for operas, it's probably among the biggest in the world. The scenery there is fantastic. So it is actually a unique spectacle show. And for their 100th anniversary of this festival, they made a free worldwide broadcast of the performance of Aida, and the star of the opera was Russian-Austrian soprano Anna Netrebko, whom I think at this point is the best interpreter of this and other operas. I was really fascinated on how she performed this, really, really good. Now the choreography was, bad. Bad is really understatement. It was a total disaster. I don't know why they do these things, but nevertheless, And then my mother called me up, and my mother called me, "Oh, how bad this choreography was." I said, "Yeah, but what about the singer? Did you like the singer?" "Oh, yeah, she was a good singer." I said, "Oh, she's a friend of Putin. Putin, that communist." "Mom, Putin is not a communist." "How do you say this?" "He's not a yes, he's a communist, and he's he's making this terrible war." I tried to explain to her. She has voted Berlusconi all her life. I tried to explain to him, how is it possible that that Berlusconi becomes a friend of a communist? Berlusconi has fought communism all his life. Every second day he says, "I hate communists." And I said, "Oh, and what is he then?" I said, "He's a liberal, but then, then she fall back again into this mode. Now, this brainwashing is gonna collapse. It's gonna collapse because there is something called principle of reality. And I read today an article in a German economic daily, Handelsblatt, which for me was very interesting. It's on the ongoing NATO defense ministers in Brussels. And this article said that the main topic dominating the NATO defense ministers meeting is, guess what? Ukraine responsibility in bombing Nord Stream 1 and 2. Now, the NATO has come out with a narrative for their purpose, which is, puts everything as all the responsibility in Kiev, in the Ukraine. We know from Seymour Hersh that the reality is different, that this was planned in Washington, this was executed by people in Norway, so we know all the details, right? Now, these people in NATO are building a narrative to put the Ukrainians out in the cold. Why? Well, they are looking for an excuse to pull out of there because they don't have the possibility and the capability to sustain further Ukraine in the war. It's as simple as that. The current counteroffensive, so-called counteroffensive of the Ukrainians, is miserably failing. They are losing a tremendous amount of lives there, and ammunitions and tanks and whatever. So the principle of reality is gonna surface, and this whole narrative is gonna break down, because what are the consequences if you establish that Ukraine destroyed a key infrastructure which is it's not formally property of Germany, but it's a vital infrastructure for Germany, a member of NATO. How are you going to deal with this? So what are the consequences? So this is an interesting question mark, and we will see in the future.
Okay, Harley, anything you'd like to say?
I'll come back to this assassination question and from a slightly different standpoint. Look, getting the truth out on these things puts lives in danger. And we know this from two major events in the last 60 years, the Pentagon Papers and the WikiLeaks. Ellsberg, who just passed away, made the point that he expected to spend the rest of his life in jail for releasing the Pentagon Papers. Julian Assange is in jail and is being killed by the British jailers who plan on handing him over to the American jailers who will then kill him. There are many people who had elements of the truth that worked with Jim Garrison who ended up meeting suspicious ends. Now, this gets back to this question of one of the elements of militarization that Cliff was talking about. The irregular warfare and hybrid warfare, the censorship, the lies, the control of the narrative, and then the ability to use the judicial system. In the United States, of course, it's the bureaucratic fascists and the professionals in the Justice Department, the permanent bureaucracy, that they are hit teams to make sure the truth doesn't get out and to scare people. And instead to get people focused on sports and entertainment and all kinds of things, cooking shows. So they don't look at the fact that their lives are being destroyed by people who are identifiable. And one of the things that Lyndon LaRouche always said is the way you avoid being assassinated, and this for him was personal because he was on a target list. And there were probably several attempts to kill him, including by sending him to prison for 5 years, initially for 15 years. But what he said is, name your assassins before they pull the trigger, so that they pay a price if they go ahead with the act. And he said this was a mistake that Kennedy made. Kennedy treated the opposition as a kind of cabinet warfare, fighting it out inside to try and win people over or isolate people, but not taking it to the public. And I think if we're to avoid what Claudio mentioned, that there is still a possibility. Look, the Ukrainians are saying they'd like to kill Putin. Helga Zepp-LaRouche is on number one on a target list from the Ukrainian Secret Service or special services working directly with NATO. I'm on that list also. So the protection for this, it's not just a question of speaking the truth, but name the networks that are responsible for this, including those who most people wouldn't think about, such as the British aristocracy, the Lords of London, the Wall Street bankers, and so on. Identify the networks and go into the archives, but get the truth out and make it clear there's a policy fight here. And I think that's why we're emphasizing that a peace movement cannot just be based on stopping war, but on winning people over to the idea that there's a higher purpose to life. That's what was in Kennedy's speech, that we do these things, all people do these things because they have a certain sense of our finite existence, of our mortality. And that if we want to leave something better, we have to do something that goes beyond the day-to-day chores of having a living and cleaning a home and things of that sort. So, I think what's important here is that we recognize the responsibility that we have to the truth, to those who went before us and those hopefully who are coming after us, and not shy away from telling the truth. I mean, one of the comments that Daniel Ellsberg made in this speech in this interview in 1971 when he announced the release of the papers is he said, "I think we cannot let the officials of the executive branch determine for us what the public needs to know about how well and how they are. You get the truth out, and this is what government should do, but if it doesn't, you need people who are the whistleblowers and the people of courage who fight for the truth." And that's what we do every single day at the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization. And we encourage others to join us.
All right. Right. Let me just try to go to Cliff if you have anything. And we're going to have one more question for you, Harley. And then I have a different form of wrap up, which I want you'll come to. So, Cliff, any response?
Well, yes. I would just say people should read George Washington's farewell address. And you can Google and find it on the internet. The Avalon Project at Yale University has many documents like that online. read George Washington's farewell address a couple of times. It's lengthy and complex. And then think to yourself, well, I'm a citizen of this republic that George Washington helped found. And these were the essence of the ideas of the founding fathers. Alexander Hamilton, as well as James Madison, helped Washington draft and edit that farewell address. So I think it's imperative now, because our republic is under such a threat by this occupation, as I mentioned. Our ruling classes are basically sort of mental colonies of the British imperialism. And finance capitalism is devastating not only this republic, but the planet. So reflect on the founding fathers, American history, reflect even on Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, to put yourself in touch with some of the key thoughts in the American tradition. And then contrast that today with what you see coming out of the White House or what you see in Congress. And that should motivate you, as Harley said, to get active and try to be a force for peace and for change. Thanks.
So what I'll do is I'll ask you this question, Harley, and then we're going to play something from Kennedy to have, and then I'll let all three of you respond to what you see. So the question that came from Anya was, does Mr. Schlanger have an opinion regarding the accusations against General Westmoreland in 60 Minutes? I believe he was set up to take the fall. Then she was asked to clarify what she meant. And the General Westmoreland, was accused of lying about troop numbers and losses, if I recall. Mike Wallace and a producer, she can't remember, who was later embedded with Charlie Wilson in Pakistan, I suppose. Don't know. So she's asking whether you know about this and if you have any thought about Westmoreland's role.
Well, the 60 Minutes story was definitely a hit piece on him, but why pick on him? I mean, the point of the Pentagon Papers is that there were, I think, 7,000 pages of statements from military officials that were, for the most part, when they were honest, they were telling the truth that the war was a mistake, it wasn't working, the casualties were high, but this was covered up. The truth was not allowed to come out. And at a certain point, the decision was made to end the war, and the decision was made not for the sake of the Vietnamese or even for the sake of the Americans. It was that there were other areas that the policy was moving towards, that the fight was moving towards, which included U.S. policy in the Middle East, and then later what became the arc of crisis of Brzezinski. So I think the Westmoreland hit was done, you know, there's any number of people. Here's the question. Where's the accountability for the people who make these policies? You know, the military officials can make advice, give advice, make suggestions, but ultimately in our government, it's the president and the executive branch and then working with Congress that decide what we're going to do. Where is their accountability? And there hasn't been. You know, you look at the fact that the Cheney and Bush lied us into a war that led to over 1 million people killed, a war that continued for a long time. We still haven't gotten to the bottom of what went on with 9/11. So without accountability, you can always scapegoat someone. And that's what tends to happen. And the real question is the deeper policy. Where's it come from? Who's making the policy and why? And we see this now. The policy is to defend a collapsing world empire, as I think Putin accurately characterized it. It's an empire a neo-colonial world which is disappearing. And it's being replaced by something which hopefully will respect the sovereignty of other nations, but more importantly, the dignity of all people. And that's what the new development architecture must be. So, accountability is one thing, but then commitment to truth and justice is the other part of that.
All right, what we're going to do is play an excerpt from Kennedy's speech given in September 20th, 1963. This is 3 months after the American University speech. It's a portion of the speech, which is about 26 minutes. And we're playing a 6-minute section. And as we go to the end, we'll ask you all to respond to that and then conclude.
But I would say to the leaders of the Soviet Union and to their people that if either of our countries is to be fully secure, we need a much better weapon than the H-bomb, a weapon better than ballistic missiles or nuclear submarines, and that better weapon is peaceful cooperation. We have in recent years agreed on a limited test ban treaty, on an emergency communications link between our capitals, on a statement of principles for disarmament, on an increase in cultural exchange, on cooperation in outer space, on the peaceful exploration of the Antarctic, and on tempering last year's crisis over Cuba. I believe, therefore, that the Soviet Union and the United States, together with their allies, can achieve further agreements which spring from our mutual interest in avoiding mutual destruction. There can be no doubt about the agenda of further steps. We must continue to seek agreements on measures which prevent war by accident or miscalculation. We must continue to seek agreement on safeguards against surprise attack, including observation posts at key points. We must continue to seek agreement on further measures to curb the nuclear arms race by controlling the transfer of nuclear weapons, converting fissionable materials to peaceful purposes, and banning underground testing with adequate inspection and enforcement. We must continue to seek agreement on a freer flow of information and people from east to west and west to east. We must continue to seek agreement, encouraged by yesterday's affirmative response to this proposal by the Soviet foreign minister on an arrangement to keep weapons of mass destruction out of outer space. Let us get our negotiators back to the negotiating table to work out a practicable arrangement to this end. In these and other ways, let us move up the steep and difficult path towards comprehensive disarmament, securing mutual confidence through mutual verification, and building the institutions of peace as we dismantle the engines of war. We must not let failure to agree on all points delay agreements where agreement is possible. And we must not put forward proposals for propaganda purposes. Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity, in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declared that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon, not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries. All these and other new steps towards peaceful cooperation may be possible. Most of them will require on our part full consultation with our allies, for their interests are as much involved as our own, and we will not make an agreement at their expense. Most of them will require long and careful negotiation, and most of them will require a new approach to the Cold War, a desire not to bury one adversary, but to compete in a host of peaceful arenas, in ideas and production, and ultimately in service to all mankind. The contest will continue. The contest between those who see a monolithic world and those who believe in diversity. But it should be a contest in leadership and responsibility instead of destruction. A contest in achievement instead of intimidation. Speaking for the United States of America, I welcome such a contest, for we believe that truth is stronger than error, and that freedom is more enduring than coercion. And in the contest for a better life, all the world can be a winner.
Claudio, your thoughts, as short or as long as you wish.
Well, I think it's what Helga said before. I mean, this looks coming from another world. If you compare it to today, to the state of policy today, I mean, I marked a few words like peaceful cooperation, mutual interest, agreement, and everything what he says can be done today. You know, the proposal of going together with the moon, everything can be underwritten. So maybe we can add what Lyndon LaRouche, well, you know, it's going to complete the idea of disarmament.
Okay, Cliff?
Well, there's a beautiful speech. As Claudia said, it seems like another world. The world that was 60 years ago that President Kennedy was representing. I was a high school student at the time of his assassination, so seeing these videos brings back memories. I would just say that following what President Kennedy said, the key theme there is peaceful cooperation. And we had that a little bit earlier in the mid-50s with the Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement. And that was several dozen countries back then. And they, India, China, and other countries doing that. And they had the concept of peaceful coexistence. So it's interesting to hear Kennedy reflect that thought of peacefully coexisting and peacefully cooperating. How do we get there? President Kennedy was emphasizing diplomacy. And as I said earlier today, we have to end this militarization of foreign policy, dominated by the military-industrial complex, which of course is financed by Wall Street and directed by Wall Street and finance capitalism. So, in short, President Kennedy's message of diplomacy and peaceful cooperation, I think, should be foremost in our minds right now when we reflect on the current crisis in Europe, Ukraine, and our relations with Russia, China, and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cliff. Harley?
Well, I think what Claudio and Cliff just said is important and right to the point. I would just add one other point. When Kennedy first came in as president, he was looking at space as a way of showing the superiority of American science and technology as a race to the moon. And we have to get there first. And that was the push that was going on in the insider circles. But now we see by September 1963 a change. The idea of, instead of national competition, a joint mission, and one undertaken for all mankind. That flows directly from the ideas that were embedded in his June 10th speech. And so I think the importance of getting people to listen to these speeches and thinking about them from the present context. There's no reason why we can't have a world that was of the sort that was the vision of President Kennedy on June 10th, 1963. And the fact that there was a change in him to reach that point should give us some hope that if we have enough impact with this speech and with our ideas, then we can reach the people who are making policy and get the kind of changes that were underway at the time that he was assassinated.
Thank you. Cliff Kiracofe, Claudio Celani, and Harley Schlanger. I want to thank all three of you for being with us today, and I want to thank everybody for staying with us through this discussion. Also, the people who asked the various questions. We didn't get to all of the questions, but we got to a lot of them. I just want to say a few things in closing. We are now 40 years past the proposal that was made by Lyndon LaRouche 20 years after the American University speech. It's called the Proposal for the Strategic Defense Initiative. That what Lyndon LaRouche recognized, and he wrote various books about it, is that various forms of arms negotiations, while they are essential and necessary, can't actually stop war. And what LaRouche did was to propose the notion of superior new physical principles, using, in particular in this case, laser defense weapons. And he proposed this to President Ronald Reagan after having worked on this proposal for many years prior to his proposing it to President Reagan, in 1983 in particular. And the president, in fact, adopted LaRouche's policy. And that policy would have rendered thermonuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, as the president said. And it was proposed as a joint collaboration between the United States and the Soviet Union. The proposal, for various reasons, was rejected, and it never actually became policy. Lyndon LaRouche was himself persecuted, prosecuted, and ultimately imprisoned as a result of that policy. But at the same time as that was done, that policy was put forward, another venture began, which was called the Schiller Institute. This was originally a proposal made by Helga Sepp LaRouche with the intention of finding a way to revamp, redo, not merely American foreign policy, but the foreign policy approaches of various nations of the transatlantic sector, largely modeling it on the work that had been done by the great 15th century diplomat, theologian, thinker, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, a person who will become better known in the next days and weeks and months as we begin to look more deeply into this issue of Kennedy. Because the issue of Kennedy and the issue of his speech has another actor. There's another actor involved, John the 23rd, and his Pacem in Terris encyclical, which at the time, during the period of from April of 1963 in particular through the American University speech and just after, was very much appreciated and very much studied. We can only say here that the concept of the general welfare, as expressed by Pope John the 23rd and as thought about by John Kennedy, who gave his American University speech 1 week after the death of John the 23rd, was a form of higher peace, a sort of a higher discussion rooted in fundamental principles of philosophy and theology and epistemology that allowed the West if you will put it that way, to engage Russia and the Soviet Union in a much, much different way. That is the level that is required of us. And there's no one in the present premises of Foggy Bottom, which is sort of another name for the State Department. There's no possibility that anybody there is even going to think of these kinds of things. But that shouldn't really bother the American citizen. I mean, there was an entire revolution and a constitution established in order to assert that whenever any government becomes destructive of the ends of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right and duty of the citizens to alter and abolish that government, to throw off such government. But you can't do that unless you have a set of principles, a set of ideas that, in fact, are communicable and intelligible to other citizens. And that's what we have. The Schiller Institute has that. The LaRouche organization has it. Its collaborators have it. But we don't have a franchise on it, as can be seen from Kennedy's speech, as can be seen in the discussions of several people, individuals, and even some organizations presently on the scene, as can be seen in Brazil's initiatives for peace, China's initiatives for peace, the 6 African nations that have visited Ukraine and Moscow, and their initiative for peace. So there is an ability to create a community of principle, but it's necessary for the individual citizen to at least make the kind of change that President Kennedy, under far greater pressure than any of us have, we have to make that same kind of change and reverse the notion of inaction. The greatest axiom that exists, that is the most pernicious and evil in nations like the United States and respective nations of Europe, is inaction. That there is some basis to say, I can't change this because, and then there's some litany of excuses that come. And that's precisely how disaster comes to nations. No such disaster need be our fate. We need not be tragic. The notions that many discuss about the collapse of empires and the fall of empires and the cyclical view of history is sort of out of the turgid, dark, decadent, demented world of a Henry Kissinger. A century of that is enough. And we should move beyond that. That's the ability, that's what we have the ability to do and the opportunity to do, or so we have the responsibility to do it. If that's done, then those voices will be heard, whether we mean in Russia, in China, or in the global South. And there was a basis of dialogue that will be established. And that is our intent, both in our conference of last week, as well as the subsequent discussions that we are involved in as you're involved in this today. So we invite you to take a look at the literature. There's the Executive Intelligence Review magazine, Claudio, of course, speaking there. From that, there's various things from the Schiller Institute site, and there's also the various works of Lyndon LaRouche, particularly Politics as Art, which is available from the LaRouche, from the Executive Intelligence Review site. And we invite you all, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions, to forward them to us and to get involved. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization and its Manhattan Project, we bid you